And after Lee, we had to get back, we had to get the damn place in order.
Dr. Pythagoras Petratos from Coventry Business School. He will be presenting the paper with a title, Governing the Disinformation Commons. So today's schedule is that, so we will have this research. So Dr. Petratos will presenting this research for about 15 to 20 minutes, and the rest time is for the research discussions. Before we get started, I will like to give a brief introduction about our speaker. So Pythagoras Petratos is a lecturer in finance at Coventry Business School since 2020. Previously, he was doing research at the Blavatsky School of Government, University of Oxford, and he was a departmental lecturer in finance at Said Business School, University of Oxford. He has also taught at numerous universities in the UK and abroad, including ESCP and the University of London. He earned his PhD at the University of London, and he has obtained master's degrees in software engineering, economics, European politics, and finance. Dr. Petratos is a member of many professional organizations and has presented at various conferences, universities, and cooperated with international organizations, for example, OECD, World Bank, WHO, including an internship at the United Nations. He has been invited to NATO in senior delegations of academics and think tankers. Okay, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Some years ago, I had the fortune to meet Hess and Ostrom in London, and we had an interesting discussion. Some of these things that I try to tackle today come from this discussion. So it's an honor and real pleasure to be here and actually attending the work. And I learned a lot by attending some of the seminars and talking with people here. So, governing the Disinformation Commons. And I will explain, first of all, the structure of the presentation. I will start with the importance of information. Then I will analyze knowledge and information and disinformation commons and actually highlight the difference between these two. And then talk about polycentric governance and how we can govern disinformation, mainly from an institutional perspective. So the rationale is based on Hess and Ostrom, 2007, the exploration of information and knowledge as common is still in its early infancy. Nevertheless, the connection between information in its various forms and commons in its various forms has called the attention of a wide range of scholars, artists, and activists. And I think this interest is increasing, especially after the US elections of 2016. The interest in fake news, misinformation, disinformation, they were already there, but they were more organized. We had campaigns of disinformation. So the interest in the last 5 years became even more intense than it used to be before, not only from the academic community, but also from the policy community. Another rationale is how to tackle this problem of global knowledge common, which is a very loaded term. And in the next slides, I present some definitions about global knowledge commons. There is much complexity. So when we talk about complex systems, how do we reduce complexity and how do we break them up? So I will suggest how we can do that. So this is why I choose information and disinformation for that reason instead of knowledge. And this is also consistent with the economic literature. So a lot of literature on these topics had been very fragmented, from the economic literature, from psychology, and from different literature. So through this information story, I try to connect the different literatures. And it could be very interesting to see how it will evolve. Again, it's an initial work, so still trying to understand how different parts can interact with each other. So how to govern the information commons? This is a very interesting question. especially concerning cybersecurity. And this is the work I cooperate with Scott, and we try to understand how the information commons can have an effect on cybersecurity and the risk concerned cybersecurity, and how can polycentric governance be applied in this context. So I will start with some theoretical work, which is very important, and there are two reasons for that. First of all, in order to further justify the initial comment by Elinor Ostrom about the importance of information. A lot of Nobel Prize winners, I think everyone is a prize winner, Nobel Prize winner in economics, and they have studied information. So we have Hayek, and even before Hayek, it's very important work concerning information and centralization of information. I will not go back to the history, but this was encapsulated in Hayek's work, and he talked about knowledge, but he made a distinction with information. He made also a distinction in this paper. And he argued that it is essential to construct a rational economic order. So information is key for every economic system, every complex economic system. Stigler coined the term economics of information, and he talked about the search of information. Grossman and Stiglitz argument about cost associated to information. Akerlof, Marcus of Lemons. And here we see the connection also with uncertainty and risk. It's something that I wanted to do, but then the paper became very burdensome. So I try to avoid uncertainty and risk, but there is definitely a connection there. And of course, Spencer works on signaling, and this work has been applied in other contexts. I will continue a little bit. Herbert Simon also. And again, all of them are Nobel Prize winners. Von Neumann and Morgenstern, game theory, and Sealing works about cooperation. He used information. So very important for international relations, literature, and a lot of issues. Aumann, and this is a very interesting paper because it's a technical paper, but in a kind of mathematical way, he describes the commons. So it's a different approach, but I think there is a relation with common knowledge and common priors from a more statistical and mathematical point of view. So, and I found this paper and I said, it was not recognized, but it's very interesting. And of course, North, talking about institutions and how important is information for institutions. Again, I just have a small part, but information is extremely important for institutions and the good functioning of institutions. I would like to talk a little bit about information production, which I think it's a very neglected field. And of course, there was work about efficient marketing in economics and finance. And some of the literature on production of information is based on economic. But again, and probably I have not digged too deep in this topic, but production of information is very important. And why is it important? First of all, because it has become central to our economy, and it is connected with property rights. But the actual question is who owns the information? And production can be connected with property rights. So who produces it might be able to know. And of course, it's a much more complicated argument there. But from a market perspective, the person or organization that produces the information owns the information and is attributed the information. It is also the attribution of information and the legal framework connected with this attribution and property rights. So this information, and this is why this information is very interesting, might have attribution, which is very hard to prove. So, but at the same time, it does not have property rights because no one claims this information. It's like, claiming pollution. And I draw this analogy later. No one wants to claim this information. And this is a major issue concerning attribution And actually, what can we do in order to counter disinformation, especially at the international level? It might come from other countries, but what can we do about that? And I think at the end of the day, we get back into this countermeasure of providing better information. There are some other things that we can do, but this is a big discussion and we can discuss it towards the end. But what is the distinction I'm using concerning information and knowledge? This is MATLAB's distinction, which is also recognized by Ostrom, Hess and Ostrom in both, I think, 2003 paper for sure, but also in the 2007 paper. So data are raw bits of information. Then we have information as organized data. Then we have knowledge, which is much more than that. It's cumulative knowledge. And I will present another definition, which, actually knowledge is considered to be a lot of things. There is also time and place analysis, and this is very interesting, especially concerning the institutional framework. In which place, in which institution, this is what Hayek knowledge, special knowledge of circumstances. And this is also what, Hess and Ostrom used in their framework. Information, though, should not be treated as a homogeneous product and can also qualify, as many studies argued, as common pool resource. So we'll start with information and then we're going to move to disinformation. So this is the framework of Hess and Ostrom. We have two dimensions. We have exclusion and subtractability. We have different types of goods. Here we have common knowledge. We have libraries. And we have personal computers. And what is really interesting is that all these things under the definition of global knowledge commons belong in the same category. But they are different goods. And there are some complications. For example, personal computers, they are private goods, but when they are connected to the internet, immediately they become more public. Because there is flow of information, there are other characteristics that I talk in the paper. So it's very interesting. And where are the limits? It's not very clear. It's a continuum, and there is some literature on that. But where are the limits between these categories? Where does personal computer? Is it a private good or is it more towards common pool resources? Close to library. So it's not very clear where exactly its category lies. And this complicates further the problem. Hess and Ostrom talk about artifacts, they talk about a lot of things. But the most recent literature on knowledge commons is even more complicated. So it includes, this is from the paper, I think it includes infrastructural elements, but the definition is, a broad set of intellectual, cultural resources, legal infrastructure, intellectual infrastructure, mental models, institutional aspects, rules, informal norms. There are so many things in such a loaded definition. And when we try to analyze the commons, I think one of the objectives is to reduce complexity and being able and manage and understand what's going on there. So when you have definitions like that, I think and loaded terms, they rather complicated the picture. And the more you have, complexity increases exponentially because you have many more interactions and complexity. So when you add two complex systems, it's not the addition, you have even more complexity than the sum of the previous two systems. So I would like to simplify and reduce complexity for that reason. I use information and disinformation commons. I split it in two categories. One category is the technology infrastructure category, so server databases. And the distinction is something also that Hess and Ostrom talked about flow. So information is mainly flow in these systems. And the same logic is followed by another author, Herbert Simon, talked about flows, and there is a big literature talking about flows. So the concept of information and flow, fits very well. And the other is more stock, the physical elements. Something that I miss in the paper, and it's a limitation, it's the interaction between the two. Because one of the issues, especially with disinformation, is how technology amplifies it. So how the infrastructure plays a role in transforming it. But again, this distinction is still valid because, they can interact with each other. We have two systems that interact. It's perfectly fine from a methodological point of view. And also, I assume rationality, especially with disinformation, and conspiracy theories. Rationality might be pretty hard to assume, but again, for reasons of simplifying the model and analysis, for the moment, I use a common assumption in economics, which is rationality. But let's discuss disinformation. So disinformation is the dissemination of deliberately false information. So there is intention, and there is also, harm. Therefore, it can be viewed as negative marginal utility information. So, and this is something I have not expanded in the paper, but I would like definitely to expand. So there is relationship between information and disinformation. So disinformation is, in a sense, negative information. And it's how you model that. But we can have a discussion towards the end about that. So in that sense, it's a negative production externality. And the next question is this information a common pool resource? Yes, it is. Using the framework of Ostrom and Ostrom, exclusion and joiners of use, it is difficult to exclude this information, so for that reason it qualifies as a common pool resource. But I found pretty hard to understand the consumption argument. Because this information is there, it is consumed, but actually no one wants to consume it. It's a little bit strange. You do not buy this information. There are different ways to think about that. But then I thought the simplest solution to this model is to expand the previous graph and say it's subtractability of production. So at this level, there is subtractability because there is limited production, because there are limited resources for this production. And I think this is very interesting to model. I went and I look at some papers, Buchanan, the 65 paper, and some other papers, very interesting papers about analyzing these graphs, utility functions, production functions, joint production. It's more of a mathematical question and modeling, but I think, this might provide a solution there. So in that sense, it does qualify for common pool resource, but in order, since the mathematical proof is not there, I wanted to further justify my argument. And I used two analogies. One is with pollution that has been treated as a common pool resource. And the other one is weapons. And there are a lot of arguments by the State Department and other agencies that this information is actually a weapon. And, there are interesting examples. For example, when you put this information in a network, and there might be coordinates, satellite coordinates, or ATAT, who is expert on that. And then you end up, with your artillery hitting, your position instead of the other position. This is disinformation, or disinformation can be used. It's not only about election, it can be used for phishing attacks. They send you a notice and, claiming that it is your bank, but actually it's not your bank. So it can be used in different ways, and by different actors for that reason. So again, joint product, I think there is also a difference with weapons, because weapons are more directly related with defense and security. Disinformation is a much more complex phenomenon. It creates more instability. Is it part of defense and security policy of some countries? There is a big argument. But it's very interesting what happens there and what are the marginal utilities and the jointness with other goods as defense and security. And for that reason, since it qualifies as a common pool resource, we try to do some polycentric governance analysis, a little bit of institutional analysis, and this is where the paper could go, actually use the institutional analysis and development framework and elements of that. It is using very few, but it could be more rigorous. And of course, the framing is from US perspective for many reasons. The first thing is the Constitution and disinformation, freedom of speech and press, very important for disinformation. There are some exceptions. These are the main exception categories. Then we have all these agencies, the Federal Communication Commission, the US Department of Commerce, which actually tried to do something with the Investigation and Threat Management Service. And because it violated freedom of speech, it's not very clear. They shut it down. So not very effective. The Federal Trade Commission, US Department of Health and Human Sciences, but the US Department of Health and Human Sciences is using misinformation for many reasons. Federal Election Committee, of course, and this is connected with the state level. POD, not very active, but it became very active with Defense Threat Reduction Agency, very interesting agency. And I think the main agency is Homeland Security and the Cyber Infrastructure Security Agency, and they have a specialized unit for disinformation. And of course, intelligence agencies, but we don't know a lot about them. They're pretty secret. And State Department, of course. And at the international level, we have United Nations. Again, there is the General Assembly resolution. UNESCO is providing education. ITU, I will argue it's not so active, although there are some coordination and cooperation with UNESCO, and they try to create an agency, WHO, and of course, NATO, which recognized disinformation in 2018 in its Brussels Declaration, very important. And there are some attacks related to troops concerning disinformation. This goes back to the argument about weapon. Is it a weapon? And it can have significant consequences. So is the institutional framework enough, sufficient to govern Disinformation Commons? I think it is not. Although, there are some statistics about disinformation and misinformation that 80% of the population has been affected, et cetera, by Ipsos. So it's a huge phenomenon. But do we have the institutional capacity and the coordination? I think we do not. We need an information institution. And in the paper, there are arguments also that we don't have an agency or an institution responsible for disinformation. They do not have a clear mandate. And we can have this discussion with the FCC and some other guys who are trying to deal with it. So I argue for an information institution that will have a mandate, it will have the resources, and it will have also the technological sophistication to coordinate with domestic and foreign actors. I do not see it as a centralized authority. I see it more as a coordinating authority between all these different parts, which is, I will not say chaotic, but not probably very well coordinated. And this brings memories about the United States Information Agency. I think we need a different model and also to avoid duplication with the State Department. When the United States Information Agency was dismantled, a lot of its activities moved to the public diplomacy. But again, public diplomacy is a different thing in many ways. And thank you very much. There was a lot of material. I tried to be consistent, so I overran a little bit my time. There are limitations, but so I will appreciate your feedback and any questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, now it's time for discussion. So everyone who has any question or comments in mind can just.
Do you want to?
Someone who's here, sort of.
Yeah, I can help you with the moderation here. So you want to start and then you can go.
Yeah.
Okay, Mike. Okay, good.
Thank you so much. This is really engaging. And I, for the mini conference on Monday, also am trying to fit knowledge commons into the 2x2 square. So I empathize, and I was thinking about some of the things you said on that slide about if it's subtractable or not. And I think I kind of think of knowledge like the non-physical flow units as non-subtractable, because if Shannon has disinformation, there's not less of it for me to get. In some ways it like increases because now she has it. So I guess I would think of it more as non-subtractable. And then your point about people not wanting to buy it. First, I would say my Uncle Keith definitely wants to buy it. He's like really excited about it. And I bet there's a lot of people. But I wonder also about thinking more seriously about like not the end consumer doesn't pay for it, but like someone is paying for it and then like donating it to my Uncle Keith. And so I wonder if that's a different way to think about the payment. But I was curious about I'm sorry, this is just, I'm not familiar with the field, the idea of it being a negative marginal utility. And I assume that it's like a negative utility to some people, but positive to others. And so how do you account for that? And also just what does the term mean?
Yes, great questions. And I think this is why, I touch the production externality, at the production level, because, if you are a producer of disinformation, actually you are using information to do harm. This is the intention, to do harm. So the end user cannot decide. And why they cannot decide, and this is where the rationality simplification comes in, because they don't know that is disinformation. Yeah. So they consume something which they think it's something different. They think they consume information, but they don't know about it. So this is where the complications lie. So I moved one level down to the production, because there are certainly budget constraints when you want to produce and disseminate this information. States, they have to do it very sophisticated. They employ specific agencies, they run campaigns. So at the production level, I think we could see some subtractability because we have specific resources there and budget constraints. Again, as I say, I have not modeled that, but it will be very interesting because it goes one level down. And we don't have, again, this jointness with other products. You said, about the perspective. Is this information actually with what else is connected? Is it connected with defense and security policy? It might be. It might be. The same argument with weapons, but it's a more indirect relationship. With weapons, balance of power, it's pretty clear. With disinformation, I think it's a kind of gray area. And certainly this is what, I would like to expand on and look at some of these questions. And concerning marginal utility, it's like pollution. The more you pollute, the more problems you cause, the more negative externalities you cause, the more harm you do.
Okay.
The same effect is with disinformation.
Thank you for interesting presentation. I agree with you that the definition of which type of research is very tricky. It can be a few, and it might change. And I do have some comments. about it first? Is it a research? I mean, if the value is negative, is it a research or anti-research, anti-resource? If no one claims rights on it, maybe it's open access instead of because I mean, some people just put it out there so other people can spread it out. On the other hand, it might be a resource that people use to make money. There was an interesting story about a radio host who was spreading anti-vaccine vaccine hesitation, and a few of them actually died from COVID. And so, and there was a discussion: will they now stop? And the conclusion there was that there is a demand for this kind of a talk. Which means that there will be supply because radio hosts make money if there are listeners. So this information can also be a commodity that you can make money of. And here the case of Alex Jones, which is a different kind of this information, it's also interesting. He made his whole career from it. So
great points. And actually I was thinking all of them. And this is the argument that it's not a homogeneous good. So it has different actors. It has, at the state level, it behaves completely different, and it is like a weapon. When we get into cybersecurity and with organized crime, it behaves differently. And when we get into commercial, and this is why I mentioned FTC, and actually, the Department of Commerce was trying to do that, not very successful, but FTC is trying to do things like that. And protect against disinformation and misinformation. It's mainly through misrepresentation, I think. I look at their website and I don't know how to judge that. So I will appreciate your opinion. They have something like, for the last few years, 147 cases. Are these enough cases when you have so much disinformation, especially in the medical sector? In the medical sector, although the Securities and Exchange Commission, and I didn't mention that because it's pretty well established. There were some cases with, some healthcare. I think the Securities and Exchange Commission and financial markets is a different story. They're much better regulated. There is much more market efficiency there. Again, this does not exclude the case that we might see misrepresentation or we might see disinformation for making a profit. But this is a different category, and this is why it's so complicated. State actors have different behavior. Cybersecurity and organized crime has different behavior, because when you get a phishing attack, of course, they want to make a benefit out of that. They're going to get your passwords and get your money from the bank or anything else. So yes, there is joint production also in some cases, but it will be very interesting, how to make this distinction, and if we can at least, I will not say quantify, I will say categorize a complex phenomenon. Thank you for your feedback.
Mike?
This was fascinating, and I read through your draft real quick here, and you covered just about everything in the presentation, which is impressive. And so it's a good start at sort of the overview of the different kinds of literatures you want to bring in and stuff like that. And I have some more specific comments about. There's a few more Nobel Prize winners you can squeeze in there. I think we'll talk about that later. But let me give you sort of a different reaction, because there's other stuff I added in. And let me start by saying I learned about some disinformation campaigns long before I knew anything about Commons or Ostroms or CPRs or anything like that. And that's because I read a lot of history and a lot of international conflict and stuff. In World War II, the D-Day invasion was absolutely critical step in helping the Allied forces beat the Nazis. Okay, that's clearly known. And that probably wouldn't have happened without a very extensive disinformation campaign run by the British and the Americans and the other Allied services that was usually summarized as sort of, the truth was so precious it needed to be protected by a bodyguard of lies. There were various sorts of information campaigns. There was this massive effort to convince Hitler and the top German generals that the Allies were going to land somewhere other than Normandy. Okay. And as a consequence, the German forces were at the wrong place when the invasion happened. And the Americans and the rest of the Allied forces were able to get a foothold in there. And okay, so example, a disinformation campaign that we're probably all pretty happy was used. And it's like, we all gained some benefit from that, except for the Nazis, okay? Okay, but you know, I mean, but other than that, this was a pretty good thing that happened for the world as a whole. Probably good almost, pretty close. Take the Nazis out, it's probably good. So how do you fit that in? And in that, and I think one way to do that, coming from something I also learned about the Ostrom sort of a little earlier, is that when they were doing the police studies, they made a distinction between intermediate goods and final goods. And the disinformation campaigns are almost always an intermediate good. So it's not done for itself. You don't do a disinformation campaign just to do it. And this is where you get your production stuff. It's really important. And I hope you see that more. You don't produce an information campaign just for the hell of it. Maybe you do, I don't know. If you get some joys out of that, or in some conspiracy theorists sort of love making these things up and stuff like that. Well, that's fine. You get some giggles out of that. But you do it for some other reason. You do it to fish, to get money, to whatever, or to, you know, win a war. And in the Cold War, the intelligence services on both sides of the Iron Curtain made this into a fine art, made disinformation into an absolutely fine art, very well crafted art. And if you read spy novels, John le Carre, it's all about disinformation, all this stuff. Okay? And it was a critical part of the Cold War. Now that wasn't as clearly good as the D-Day thing, but it was an important part of that. And they worked out rules for how to build it. And so you've got this entire body of experts on disinformation campaigns and what's necessary to run a successful. Okay, so when you start to build some sort of an institution that regulates these, you got to bring some experts in. Just like federal communication, you need to bring some experts. Well, for this, you need to bring in the intelligence services. And they're in there. I mean, they're already in there, you know, but and this is where it gets a little different, because within the intelligence community, there are reasons to say, hey, you know, that D-Day campaign thing, that was my idea. Okay, you know, that was our organization. We did this. Okay, so we benefit within that system. You don't tell the rest of the world about it. It was decades until this was known. Okay, because this was a deeply kept secret. This and the ultra stuff and the Enigma machines and all that kind of stuff. It was all kept secret. But within the intelligence community, there was a real incentive for different organizations and different leaders, different factions to take credit for this. So in a sense, there is sort of a place where it's a property right. But anyway, what I'm saying is that you need to have people step back and see this as an intermediate product or intermediate good that can be used for lots of different purposes. Okay, and to draw from the expertise of those who know how to run these campaigns. Okay, and so, you know, but that doesn't mean that the disinformation is a commons or that it's a CPR. But it's something that happens when information is so important. And information, as your list of Nobel Prize winners, is always important. I mean, it just in all aspects of economics, policy, or you know, production, sales, whatever. It's all important. So it's a very important part. But you need to find a way to get this information corralled and respected for what it is when it's done for the right purposes. And yet how you can use those same techniques to limit its effects, or, you know, constrain its effects, just like you regulate industries in order to prevent the pollution, which is an inevitable part of production, to limit that and get them to improve this sort of stuff. So it's a question of not getting rid of disinformation. That's not going to happen. Okay, it's like pollution, and you're always going to have those kinds of things. You can minimize it, but you're not going to get rid of it. But how do you manage it? And then you raise a whole other questions, and that's where the polycentric governance comes in.
Thank you.
And I'll stop.
Very interesting, but I think there is also distinction there. What happens in cases of war and what happens when we have peace. So we are talking about, in cases of war, then it's more of a joint product. It is more directly related with strategic objectives and military strategic objectives. This can happen now. We cannot exclude that, but the effect is not there. So we cannot immediately see the effect. And this is the case with NATO and what Russia was doing. It can affect the broader invasion. There are arguments about that, but what is a different, I think it's things do change. What was my other comment concerning that? Towards the end, there is, actually an interview that I quote, and he says, okay, no one is responsible for that. It's a former counsel to NSA. Someone obviously should be responsible. And he argues that the best responsible agency might be the counterterrorism community.
Yeah, that's where I was getting. Yeah,
And, I completely agree.
exactly right. They're the experts in stopping
I
disinformation
completely agree with that. So,
and in running them.
yeah.
And in running them.
But, when you get to social media and content and other issues, you might need other communities to do that. So I'm not excluding that this community will not participate in an information agency or an information institution. It might be part of that according to the agents. And especially when you deal with national agents, you need them. With organized crime and cybersecurity, it might be a completely different story, or with what Eitan said about commercial interest might be a different story. So this information institution can be a collection of expertise and actually matching different actors that provide this information. And another argument is, it's not a direct relationship which is very visible. For example, a lot of people credit the US Information Agency winning part of the Cold War.
Yes, exactly. That's another good example, right?
I think that's right. But what they did is not only counter disinformation, also provide good information. And they say, guys, this is what, freedom looks like.
You're countering disinformation that
Yes.
their own governments were doing.
Exactly. So my argument is, when you create an agency like that, you just counter. And we had this argument with Dan about, and I didn't add it in the paper, about how much information you have to produce. And I think this is when you get into cardinal utility, which is very hard to measure. You just rank it. And this is why we need a categorization there. And there are a lot of complex issues. And, again, it can be about the quality of information too. You counter disinformation, and disinformation can be very negative with much better quality information. So if you see the spectrum there, quality does matter, plus the channels and how you amplify that. But in order to do that, I don't think, especially what the FCC is doing about content, and this is a big argument right now with the FCC, I think the FCC does not want to touch that. They say, okay, we know it's a problem, but the next administration will deal with that. So they are just shifting it. And there are a lot of problems with FCC reforming to take into account the different technological developments. So in avoiding these problems of coordination, an institution might be, an information institution might be useful. It's a big discussion how you create that, but, your arguments, I think it's definitely good how to do that.
So a couple of things with history, disinformation campaigns go back at least to the Trojan War. At least that far. But creating a sort of information agency or some kind of clearinghouse, I see political problems, right? Because you're getting pretty close to the Ministry of Truth.
Yeah.
Orwell's Ministry of Truth. And how can you accomplish the legitimate aims without giving rise to potentially really bad things.
Yes. There is a simple way to do that, which I said it's the oversimplification in the beginning. Provide more information and better information. Because when you start, prohibiting disinformation, then you hit into the freedom of speech. And I don't think, especially in the United States, that can happen. So the information institution could monitor and identify what other actors are doing, foreign governments, organized crime. They can monitor all that. They can coordinate with CISA. They can coordinate with other agencies. But at the end of the day, what they will have to do is provide better information. And this is exactly what the US Information Agency was doing, with broadcasting in different ways.
But it's not all that we're doing.
Yeah, you have to be very careful.
Can I go on then? So it's so as a follow-up to maybe Mike's and Dan's point, it's like I think the analogy with weapons is almost perfect for the following reason. First of all, what you have is essentially a negative sum game. I'm doing something in order to increase my chances of getting something, and then overall, I'm just increasing the probability of winning a buy that is given. I'm spending resources in order to do that. So that's exactly the way weapons work. And on top of that, the way you counter weapons is with weapons. The ways you counter misinformation or disinformation, it's again with misinformation or with information. Okay, so I think I could pursue more this analogy with weapons rather than not. The second point is like I think there is a very important question here is like what are the limits of competition? So essentially, you have almost free entry to providing information. It's relatively cheap. Okay, in some sense, it's more costly to manufacture lies than you just provide the truth in some cases. So why competition in a world in which entering and showing truth is so cheap is not fully displacing misinformation? Okay, so that's one way of thinking. So again, I agree with you that this is not happening. We don't fully understand why it's not happening. Okay, so and then the final thing is connected with Dan's point. I think the main problem here is that even if you say I will not be censoring what I believe is misinformation, I will be just calling this thing disinformation, but I also have incentive to start calling disinformation or misinformation things that do not align with my interests, and they are true. So essentially, the problem reappears even if you fully separate and you create an agency with, the mandate to only provide information and do not censor. If they build a reputation that so again, what would be the only valuable thing of this agency? A reputation of calling things misinformation or disinformation or not. But of course, they may have incentive to use that politically to essentially censor true information. So I think we go back essentially at the end, we ended up in kind of the check and balances story, competition, and what are the limits of competition in those cases. No? So
Great points. And I will start from your last point. Disinformation is completely different than disinformation. And the intent there. So if you know that there is an intent, there is an intention to harm you, then you can react. Misinformation is a different thing and it's a gray area, and then you hit more problems with freedom of speech and censorship. But disinformation is very clear because someone intends to harm you. And you know where you can trace where this disinformation, and this is why you need a better monitoring method and technology to be able to identify that. It's pretty hard, in the cybersecurity and in such a complex system to identify where this information is coming from. We don't know the bots. Still, we try to understand how social media and some of the bots work.
Just one parenthesis there. I don't think it's a good idea to have such a sharp distinction between disinformation and misinformation, because I think the best way of lying is to mix truth with lies.
they do that.
And then as a consequence, even if
Yeah.
you really, the only thing that you want to have is to harm some party to increase your probability of winning something, you should be mixing this with truth so you are more reliable. So essentially, you always end up with misinformation rather than with like pure.
No, because the intent is still there. Even if you mix it with misinformation or truth,
Yeah.
you know, the intent to harm is still there. So if the intent to harm is still there, I think the technological challenge is to find the intention to harm and actually, you know, at a pretty confident, you have to be pretty confident that, you know, this actor is doing that to me. And this is why I argue about technological advancements. All the other arguments are very good. The weapons analogy is very interesting. Again, it depends on the actors. This is why I quote, you know, the START program and, you know, nuclear. And Russia especially is about destabilization. Their strategic objective is to destabilize other countries. You know, they just destabilize, you know, they try to find, and actually, I mentioned about this asymmetry. It's more costly to counter disinformation. It's much easier for many reasons, for amplification effects. So the game should be here. We should get technological advancement in order to be able to have more amplification and better monitoring and trace it in the beginning and be able to counter it at an early stage before it spreads. So, you know, this goes more to the technological question.
And I know you are first and then you two, so yeah.
Bernie.
Oh, I'm Bernie, sorry.
After them, they've been.
After that, okay.
Sure. When reading about this, I think the major thing that comes into mind from a legal perspective is just how do you define disinformation, and that's just and I know you start with information as a way to tackle this issue, but still, I think as stated, like disinformation has been happening for a very long time, and under First Amendment we have the false statement of fact as a way to kind of categorize, and I know you said that, but I think it became a more of an important issue since the internet, right? So I'm thinking about like the line that you're trying to draw. Is it more about, and not only about like the production, but also the amplification of it? So my question is just like the line of like the definition. I know you cited like the dictionary definition, but is there a possibility to kind of just limit it to like maybe something cyber related as a way to draw the line? Because already there has been a lot of discussion. I'm not saying like those are perfect solutions there, but there has been a lot of solution. I think it just got out of hand after the internet. So there is that kind of issue that I'm thinking of drawing the line. And also just about the production, like under your definition, when Donald Trump says something, right, which you know is not true, or some other candidate say something, is that are also like a production of disinformation, news source, bots, like, so that's the first thing. The second thing is that you talk about the different institutions. And I think when it comes to the internet, it can be quite tricky because from the administrative branch, if they create rules towards the internet, that can have more drastic effect than the legislative branch. And that can be seen in China, where they have all the administrative order comparison to maybe the United States, where it usually comes from the legislative branch. So my question is, how would—
Make a parenthesis and answer that?
Yeah.
I'm against creating rules.
Yeah.
I'm for providing better information to counter that. So it's not about regulating. It's more about countering it, but please continue.
Yeah, okay, yeah, so maybe the question, so my question there was just, how would treating it as a common resource kind of facilitate maybe that interaction between different institutions? And the final is just on what you guys said about like the market. I think the marketplace of ideas theory under the First Amendment has been a major kind of discussion base when it comes to internet speech here, or information theory. So that's something that I thought that I can talk to you a little bit more, but there's a lot of discussion from that angle, the marketplace of ideas theory.
Again, you know, I'm not an expert at all at law. Actually, I'm pretty ignorant about that, but I think intent makes a huge difference there. And a lot of cases with FTC, I think they highlighted, you know, some intent, and there are other cases. You know, actually, I was pointing to some other cases, you know, and I quote some cases there. And I think intent and harm are very important. So if you can define intent and harm, you can have a pretty good definition of disinformation. And again, this is a legal question. It's a big discussion how you can do that sufficiently and burden of proof, etc. I think there is more work that needs to be done on the legal side and defining information. Actually, when I was trying to link the different information and definitions, freedom of speech is related to information, press is related to information, intelligence is related to information. So we see that information is these common concepts which can align the narrative between different institutions and different fields. So I think that that's very important. And probably we need better definitions and a better legal framework that will define that. Concerning the internet, I completely agree. And it adds more complexity. I was looking at other agencies, the Cyber Command, they don't say much about this information. So I look at other agencies, I trace the agencies that are more relevant to the analysis. This is a dynamic environment concerning the institutions. We might see more and more, or we might not have information. I'm pretty sure that they do something about this information, the US Cyber Command and some other guys. And this is why I'm here, and I believe that Scott will have some ideas concerning the cyber element. So I left it intentionally. I didn't move too much into the cyber argument, and I'm very happy to continue the conversation.
We are running out of time, so I would suggest that you collect all the remaining questions. So would you start, and then Bernie and
Yeah, I guess I just I sort of agree that I think it's probably just so difficult to make it as clear cut that you point again to intent, but humans are really bad at judging the intents of others. That's something we do incorrectly every minute of our lives. And judging harm is also really hard. And I wonder how would you do that when there is no claim of author? That if you don't even know who did it, then it's really hard to judge intent or harm, let alone get it right. And also I'm curious about on some things almost everybody would agree are true or would agree are false. But I think the vast majority of the bits of information that flow through our lives are actually much less clear of a universally convergent truth value. And so that's probably not helpful at all, but it just is I'm sure it's something that the whole field deals with.
Excellent points. Judging intent and harm.
Because we're running out of time, let me collect the yes.
Yeah.
Basically, exactly what I was gonna say. I also think pushing the limitations of truth even further with, I know this is the biggest assumption to pick on with econ, with the idea that rationality, I think it's even fair to say that humans are all rational. But when we're talking about truth, I think the assumption that our understanding of our own rationality and then the outcome of perceptions of truth, I think those are really interrelated concepts. And I'm worried you'll get some kind of issue mathematically regarding that.
Bernie, you want to?
You talked a lot about misinformation, disinformation, and information. I'm not sure the commons where it fits in this thing. It's a very small part of it. It's not the big thing. I think you overuse commons.
I will answer to these questions.
1 minute, 2 minutes. No, it's just.
Concerning intent and harm, common law. We need probably more cases to better define that. Attribution, it's always a problem. Technology can help in attribution. And again, these are challenging fields. Psychology, very important. I oversimplified, I mentioned rationality. We have some people like conspiracy theories, if you ask some part of the population, but this is why education, going back to your question about why we do not see more disinformation or people adopting more disinformation, because they realize they have good education and they say, but this is impossible to be happening. So it is, also it depends on the education, and UNESCO is trying to do that and educate not only the public, but also journalists. And it's important also to train journalists and be part of, this institution of information. So I hope I quickly, concerning the commons, I think it's a very nice methodology. Might not fit perfectly but it's a useful framework and probably is, it's like democracy. It's the best framework that we have in order to quantify that. When we would try to do something else, okay, there might be other models, but I think it can work, especially regarding polycentricity and how to coordinate institutions. I'm not saying it's, one size fits all.
So just one quick announcement. So this is the last virtual series of the semester. So we have a nice lineup of speakers for the spring semester. We're still potentially filling some spots. So it's like, by the way, this is pretty cool. So, but one reminder: you have to register again if you want to attend online on Zoom. If you are coming in person, so no problem, okay? But just please register on Zoom, and well, we are going to be very happy to have you again on the spring semester. And well, thank you, Pythagoras.
And don't forget about the holiday party next Wednesday. Hope to see you there.
Oh, I